I'm going to talk about journalistic sector of media, about journalism, and I titled this presentation as Inclusive Journalism, Examining Media Coverage of Ethnicity and Religion in European Countries, because I want to underline the key concept that has led the project that I'm going to talk about, and that concept is a concept of inclusive society, society for all, regardless the race, ethnicity, religion, age, gender, and all other things that make us different, but also similar in a sense. Following on that concept of inclusive society, I think that we have to start thinking about inclusive journalism, journalism that is for all and of all. Just a little bit about the context of the research whose preliminary results I'm going to present here. The project was run is a project that is funded by European Commission and by the Fundamental Rights and Citizenship Department. It is so-called Action Grant. A grant that supports actions that are aimed at fighting traditional and new stereotypes whose diffusion are at the roots of racist attitudes and speech, discriminatory action and violent incidents. And I cite here that justification from the call for the proposals, just to give you an idea what is actually expected from the project that they support. The proposal for the project called Ethical Journalism Initiative Campaign to Fight Racism and Discrimination Through the Highest Professional Standards of Journalism was sent by 3 organizations, led by International Federation of Journalists, their European branch, Article 19, and Media Diversity Institute. Several activities were proposed and they are already running. And one of them, one of the things that these 3 organizations has promised in their proposal was to produce a study on media, ethnicity, and religion in the light of the EU Fundamental Rights Framework. I work at the Cardiff University, and I also occasionally work as an academic consultant for Media Diversity Institute, and they asked me if I would like to design and run a research that will result in the study on media coverage of ethnicity and religion. And when I first thought about that future study, the first idea was, of course, to do analysis of the media coverage of ethnicity and religion, type of, led by a question that all of us are familiar with, how media represent these issues. But then I thought that majority of the studies about media and ethnicity and religion are actually in that domain. They look at the media text, they analyze how minority groups are represented, how it might affect them, but they are mainly focused on media text. And you were talking this morning that justifying your study that is focused on consumption and on audiences, that is another area of study, one focused on text, the other focused on audiences. But studies of the actual production are not that oftenly undertaken. And I thought that that would be actually the most interesting thing to do, to look at who, how, and why reports on these issues, what do they think, how they reflect on their everyday work, what obstacles journalists have when reporting of these issues, and what do they think, what can be done to improve this coverage. The Ethical Journalism Initiative study deals with journalistic sector of the media because the assumption is that that is a vehicle to public conversation and civic action. As I said, it was a grant that was already, that 3 organizations already got, and they promised that they would cover media and ethnicity and religion in 8 European countries, in Denmark, Slovakia, Lithuania, Italy, UK, Hungary, Greece, and France. And when I looked at that proposal, I suggested to include Germany as well, for all the reasons that I won't elaborate here, for a long tradition of immigrant community there, for Angela Merkel's public speeches on multiculturalism and what should be done to achieve society that harmoniously function, and because for the reason of the balance of 3 distinctive journalism cultures in Europe that I will be talking about shortly. The study is based on interviews with editors-in-chiefs and journalists who report on ethnicity and religion. Journalists whose names are most frequently written as bylines for these news articles or television and radio news stories. The idea was to talk first to editors-in-chief, to conduct semi-structured interviews with them and ask them who are the people in the newsroom who most often write about these issues, and then conduct interviews with these people as well. 15 interviews per country, and by the end we came up with 117 interviews. In some countries there were 12, in others like France there were 17. One of the set of questions that they were asked was to think and to nominate the examples of news coverage that is in any way significant for the way journalists approach these issues. We asked these editors and journalists, what do you think? Do you remember any news story that either presented the life of ethnic minority or religious group in a way that really contributed to the public discussion of the position and status of immigrants in the society, that was an example of the best possible coverage? Or do you remember another story that was the example of a very poor coverage? When we went through all 117 interviews, I listed all the stories that were nominated, and we came up with 299 articles that journalists and editors nominated. The main question, as I said, for this study were who are the people who report of these issues? Not only demographics, what is their education, how old they are, what's the gender, and everything else that goes there, but also what are their professional norms and values? What leads them in their everyday work? And for that question, I drew on another study that I'm also part of, and it's a study called The World of Journalisms. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with that study run by Thomas Hanich. And that study covers now 70 countries across the world. And there is a template questionnaire that asks journalists to reflect on what is the role of journalism in society, what is the social responsibility of the press, and many other ethical questions that they have to answer to. And I thought, if I use that section of the World of Journalism Studies that investigates a body of all journalists and compare these results with the ethical norms and values of journalists who report specifically on ethnicity and religion, that I might come up with some useful results, and it proved to be true, and I'll say a few words about that later. The second question was what they know, what these journalists who report on ethnicity and religion know about EU legislation, national legislation, all anti-discriminatory laws and policies that are out there, and that are out there not only to help society to deal with all social issues that emerge, but that should help journalists as well to report about these issues. And the third set of questions was on how they do it. I conducted a critical discourse analysis of a sample of these articles and television news stories. And of course, the objective was what can be done to improve journalism practice, how it can be improved to break down prejudice, to tackle discrimination, to endorse common values, and to provide independent and trustworthy information. As I said, the choice of 9 countries proved to be good because they could be classified into 3 geographical clusters. Northwest Europe, new EU member states, and Mediterranean countries. And all academic research that has been done on journalism cultures indicate that these 3 geographical clusters do differ among themselves, and within these geographical clusters, journalists in specific countries share similar ethical norms. Northwest of Europe, Denmark, Germany, and the UK, Mediterranean countries, Italy, France, and Greece, and new EU states, Slovakia, Lithuania, and Hungary. So, a bit about demographics. Who are these people who report on ethnicity and religions? It turned out, as in general body of journalists, white, male, mainstream. Not always. In Denmark, there are journalists who belong to ethnic minorities or who are coming from with the recent wave of immigration, who are covering these issues. Majority of journalists that were interviewed in this study don't feel strongly about their ethnic or religious background. There was a question there, how do you feel about, how important is ethnicity or religion for you? And it relates nicely with all other studies that I'm aware of that say that when it comes to journalists, their professional identity is one that dominates. And because I am a journalist turned academic, as an individual, I can say that is the thing that defines me far more than the country where I was born, which was Serbia, or the country whose citizenship I have, which is New Zealand, or the country where I live now, which is the UK. Majority of them have a social sciences background. Majority of those who report of ethnicity and religions do have social sciences background. And although the sample is small to make general conclusions about the patterns, in that sample that we had, more than half of the people who report about these issues do have postgraduate degree, MA. One of them has PhD as well. Who reports about this? You know, in a newsroom, the division between general reporters and beat reporters. Overall, general reporters do report on ethnicity and religion, sometimes crime reporters. In some countries there are, and some of the interviewees do cover only ethnicity and religion. Many of them cover mainly ethnicity and religion, and then occasionally other beats. Here is one of the graphs, and if you are interested into findings of this study, as I said, it's still work in progress and should be finished in the next 2 weeks, and it will be published as a booklet by European Commission in May. Here is one of the findings. You can see that the differences are not huge. General reporters dominates in all three geographical clusters. In Mediterranean countries, France, Italy, and Greece, there are more beat reporters, reporters who cover only ethnicity and religion. I extracted this graph because I think that it tells a lot about the circumstances within which journalists nowadays work. And we are often, with a good reason, highly critical of the way they conduct their work. But we have to acknowledge that the environment within which they work has changed significantly. And economic pressures and everything else that we know about the crisis of newspapers and crisis of other media means that each individual singular journalist has to produce more and more stories per day. In the case, I mean, absolute record among 117 journalists that were interviewed was a journalist from the UK who produces 15 stories per day. If you write 15 stories per day...
For different media?
Yeah? Sorry?
Asking for different media.
No, for a same medium, for a newspaper where he works. 15 stories per day. And this is the number of average stories.
Per day?
Per day. 6.5. Press releases. I mean, this is a... You know, we had journalists who belong to, who write for a news agency. In a news agency, the number of stories that goes is far higher than it's. In newspaper, study that has been conducted by Cardiff University and that resulted in Nick Davies' book, Flat Earth News, showed that at average, journalists produces 7 stories per day. 7 stories per day means press releases, rewriting press releases, eventually 1 phone call, no balanced reporting, not range of sources, not investigation, just machine of a daily production in a newsroom. When it comes about the knowledge of EU legislation, blue is good and red is poor. You can see that in new member states, journalists that were interviewed told interviewers that they think their knowledge of anti-discriminatory laws is pretty poor. We asked about the knowledge of EU legislation, but we also asked for the knowledge about the national legislation. And when it comes to the national legislation in the new member states, the knowledge and understanding of these policies and laws is far higher than with the EU. I said that we asked them to nominate stories that they think are representatives for whatever is journalism contribution to the representation of ethnicity and religion. When I classified the themes, the topics of these stories, I came up with these 5 main themes. So they were asked, can you nominate a story that is most representative for the coverage of ethnicity or religion? They came up with the stories on immigration, on poverty and crime, on discrimination, on playing politics or using religious and ethnic divides for political purposes, and stories about ethnic minorities, mainly folklore and celebrations of different topics. Journalists were asked also to reflect on the way they conduct either news gathering, or they assemble a story, or they present a story, or they communicate with the editor, to highlight what step in a news production is the one that gives them the biggest headache. And they came with different answers, and all these answers actually indicated that at every step of news production, there are problems that arise with finding topics attractive enough to be published and to attract audience, in approaching sources of information, everything that we know about that. It's easier to find an official source. It requires far more time to find alternative voices. Providing background information, time and space constraints, not enough time to go in depth in reporting about these issues. Finding a right angle, and some of them make references on political correctness and not being aware, fully sure what is good and right to report on, and in presenting the story. What was interesting for me, and my general research interest is in comparative journalism and journalism practice, is that majority of them, regardless the geographical clusters, declared their dedication to values of objectivity, unbiased reporting, promotion of plurality, democracy, and civic society. Grand ideas and ideals. But when reporting about ethnicity, while at the same time they all admit that media further negative stereotypes about ethnic minorities. So they say, yes, accuracy, fairness, balance, objectivity, that's what leads us in everyday work. And at the same time, when asked, do you think that there is a media contribution to the, they say, yes, enormous. So who does that? Who does, if not editors and journalists? And that hypocrisy led to revision of the questionnaire, and generated some, I think, very interesting results. Just few of the examples from about that hypocrisy. For example, a journalist for Greece. We are not racist. We support Greek citizens. Yeah. I mean, there is no but. So it's not the usual disclaimer that says, I'm not racist, but I think that they should do something. But it says, we are not racist, we support Greek citizens, as if those who came are not citizens, not people living there. Or people don't care about successful integration stories from Italy. They care about negative stories, as we know, about news values and everything else. They care about bad stories, conflict stories. In France, so there is a law in France that you can't state someone's ethnicity or religious affiliation. So no religious background is provided unless it is relevant for the story. But it is fine to use the term Muslim gangs. Yeah? In Denmark, what was interesting for me, one of the responses, who writes about these stories? The guy said, we have a church journalist and an integration journalist and a religious reporter, so 3 in one newsroom, reporting on other denominations than the Lutheran Church. So if it is church, it's Lutheran Church. And if it is immigration, it's the integration reporter. And for all other religious dominations, it is religious reporter. What are the obstacles to good reporting? Many were listed, but all of them can be summed up in these: lack of knowledge, lack of in-house training, poor financial state of the media, heavy workload, lack of time. If those of you who do research of journalism practice, you know that all these factors are obstacles to good reporting on politics, on environment, on science, on ethnicity and religion. So not that different when it comes to coverage of ethnicity and religion from coverage of any other issues. What I wanted to extract from these studies were the examples of great coverage, because I do strongly believe that what helps more journalists are these role models and the cases of how it can be done successfully. That certainly motivates at that practical level than poor criticism of a dreadful discriminatory reporting. What we found was how, when it is done successfully, how it is done. There are new forms of community engagement in the UK. Some big mainstream media have wonderful projects. Financial Times, for example, runs so-called news readings once a month in some small community where that is diverse. They organize a public talk about their paper. An editor and a journalist comes, talks about what is covered in the press, handles the questions from the audience, and communicates with this community in order to see what can be done to be improved. Or, for example, I know Guardian, but other media as well, run short internships for young people from minority background who would love to become journalists. And they come to these big newsrooms, have a training and an internship, for that. And other forms of community engagement in the UK. What was most interesting for me is the revival of undercover reporting. The thing that Günter Wallraff did in Germany in the 60s and in the 70s, well, later as well, living the life of minority and then coming up with the stories. Examples in Germany, in Lithuania, in Denmark, in France. Living in some other shoes. In Denmark, a guy went with 3 North African friends to a disco to see how the guards at the disco entrance will react when they see their black faces. And in 3 of them, they were rejected to enter only based on the color of their skin. And the journalist who went with the group was of minority background. And he wrote a report how it felt, what was the communication, how it worked. He exposed racism in the same way as Günter Wallraff did so many years ago when living as a Turk for 3 years. Some newspapers run special supplements, and that's popular in Italy. But there is a question about that, because if you have a special supplement that is devoted on 2 minutes, okay, I'm finishing soon, then it's a kind of ghettoization of the minority group. And in France, who has a long tradition of interpretative reporting, of literary journalism, of highly personalized stories, we believe individual stories of people for people are the most effective tool to raise awareness on these issues. I use the example that Cyrine used just an hour ago about a French journalist from Le Monde who published highly personalized account of what he has experienced as a journalist of minority background. And I will finish with this. The whole, as I said, this is an action grant, so what is required are recommendations, what can be done to improve that. And I came up with this, obviously, journalism training and education, workshops with practicing journalists, but also inclusive curriculum at the universities. Improving newsroom diversity. All journalists that we interviewed, there was a specific question said that might help. I mean, it won't solve the problem, but that might help. You mentioned Ted Glasser and Rodney Benson, and we can argue about that. But journalists who are in the field say, yes, newsroom diversity will help a lot. Working with civil society organizations, internship programs, encouraging professional reflexivity, And that's what I think is extremely important at all levels. Introducing news ombudsmen and public editors, inviting guests to a newsroom who will talk about these issues, journalism awards that stimulates good coverage. And of course, without doubt, improving general journalism practice, both in terms of the method that journalism is done, in terms of the account, reports, and television stories that are published, and approach, and that's what I have in mind when I think about ethical norms and values. Okay, that's it.